Oh, welcome back to Stream of Thoughts, where I pretty much stream all of my loose filtered thoughts. This time around, I wanted to try something different, see what I could do with what I could do with a review, or kind of a review system. I do have notes, but, most of this will be unfiltered thought of what I think about Hollow Knight. So, I guess without further ado, let's start. So I guess it should be mentioned that this type of review may feature spoilers, may not. I'll try my best to try to avoid talking about the major ones, but there might be some things I spoil here and there. So, I guess to start, we need a bit of background of how I played it, about Hollow Knight itself, before I start actually getting in depth into what I thought about it. So some some minor research I did, it was described to me as kind of a Souls-like Metroidvania, and this was made in 2017, and it is still quite well, still very popular to this day. People still enjoy it, people still praise it. And so at the time, I want to say it was February or March, I decided to hop into it with streaming. So, I guess a bit more about the game itself. Made by Team Cherry, an indie team of 3 people. Uh, Based in Australia, I believe. I actually forgot to write that in my notes. So for them to accomplish a feat such as this on this game, and the fact that there's so much anticipation and hype towards the second one, is quite a feat. And so, yeah, I heard about this game, and I decided that since I've heard its praise for so long, since I've heard about its soundtrack, I've heard about just being a fun Metroidvania, and I've had experience with a fair bit of Castlevanias and Metroid, so I do enjoy a little bit of Metroidvania. And to hear it kind of feels a bit Dark Souls like, which I guess would refer to its difficulty or respawn system. It caught my interest, and so as a result, I decided that would be my first stream game. And so this might be important to note for later, but so I basically played Hollow Knight on stream once a week for about an hour and a half for an entire 6 months, kind of trying to get full completion. I'm almost there, I'm still playing it. Should mention that yes, at this point in time, I know videos are still being uploaded, but I have finished streaming it. Yes, I pretty much finished everything I pretty much wanted to do with the game. And I'm about near its 112% completion point. And so, yeah, with it, I guess first impressions, it definitely did, it did Metroidvania as well. To the point where it kind of felt so, I guess, open-ended, where it started to kind of remind me a bit of Breath of the Wild, the way the game was executing a lot of its things, and not just the world, but even its stories, the way it tells its story being very minimal. And with that, I guess let's hop into kind of the story aspect of the game. So here, not all. It's an interesting way they wanted to tell the story, in the fact that there is a story present, but it's very minimal, and it's kind of difficult to fully grasp the entirety of it. Just playing it once. Yeah, just playing it once through, and I guess even from my perspective, doing it for playing it once a week for an hour and a half, it was very hard to find story beats and whatnot. Typically, when telling a story, generally, they often have to retell certain aspects or facts as a technique in order for a person, be it a reader, a viewer, or a player, to kind of recall certain aspects of that story, which is why they may need to iterate a fact several times. But for this game, it doesn't really do that. Story is, well, or it doesn't feel like they do that. Story feels like it's just scattered everywhere throughout the world, and it's kind of up to the player to kind of piece together the puzzles. I mean, I'm not even sure if it would be really difficult for just one person alone to try to piece together the aspects of the game. But perhaps that was their intent, and socializing was a part of it. Or perhaps not. In which case, assembling that story would just be very difficult for that one person. Now, for me personally, I mentioned this twice before, I've only played it an hour and a half a week. And I'll be honest, I didn't get much of a grasp on the story. There were things that I was doing where I'm like, where I asked myself, why am I doing this? Well, I mean, I don't want to say I'm totally confused by the story. Generally, I know how it goes. You go through the game, first off, Lost Wanderer, and then eventually this objective is given to you to defeat the three, and then, well, it basically leads to the final boss of the game. Fairly simple. And, well, that's just for basic completion. Of course, then you start learning about the infection, and learning about how it just, well, I guess infects would be a bit of a redundancy, but you start learning about the world. And this is kind of why I compare it to Breath of the Wild, where there's minimal storytelling. The story isn't really the true focus, I guess, would be the aspect on it. It feels in both games departments. Breath of the Wild definitely highlights its exploring and freedom of action. And Hollow Knight kind of feels like it's doing that exact same thing. I'm not saying one imitates the other. I can't remember when Breath of the Wild came out, but it's just a comparison drawn. Well, the comparison I drew from it. So, going back to Hollow Knight, whenever facing the, I guess I'll call it true final boss of the game, there was a bit of confusion as to what I was doing anymore. As to why it needed to be done. But other than that, as I said before, it didn't feel like Hollow Knight didn't need to have a strong focus on the story. Story felt like, I don't want to say side material, but something that you could explore further into. And that's exactly what I did once I finished the game. I basically went to the wiki and kind of started to piece everything together from there. And I don't have everything. I'm not totally invested, but there were bits and pieces that I want to see for myself. A bit of story parts that I missed. And just how it all comes together. And when it comes together, wow, it's a solid story in the sense that it is actually pieced together. And so I do have to applaud that, just scattering pieces of the puzzle throughout the world and putting them in places where they make sense. And now I guess this is a good segue to how I feel about the world. I mean, talking about Breath of the Wild, the world feels so open but very guided. It feels, for me, I guess it feels like a 2D open world almost. There's, well, you're very limited onto the first parts of the game, but as soon as you start getting, well, as soon as you start going, then parts of the world opens up to you. You get to choose the things you want to do if you could recall them, and that's pretty good. Pretty good compared to a lot of Metroidvanias I've played, where generally, I mean, you generally go through a labyrinth, and then you have to go through area by area, one at a time, as the game intends for you to do it, is generally how Metroidvanias work. You go through an area, you find a place you can't have access to, you remember it, you go through the rest of the area, get the thing that allows you to have access to that, go back, and then go into the next area. So there's this linear aspects to some Metroidvanias. But Hollow Knight, as I said, once you get going, you get to choose where you want to go. At near the very start of the game, I believe, before you enter, how would I call it? The village of the game. The first village of the game. Although that could get confused with Dirtmouth. But yeah, immediately if you die there, you get someone who tells you, hey, you don't need to do this if you want. There's a place where you could upgrade your sword and you have access to it. And just from there, the game starts to branch off. You could just avoid doing that and continue your quest some other way. And then eventually it leads to finding the three, in which you have the freedom to choose which one you want to take on, or which ones to hold off on until you get stronger. And I really like that. It's very open. It's very considerate to the player's it gives a lot of options to the player, and pretty hard to do with I guess a Metroidvania type style game, and I'm glad it doesn't fall into that sinkhole. In addition to that, kind of an aspect I really liked about it is kind of how the world was alive. It's weird because, well, the game is generally about emptiness. You're exploring just hollow caves, mines, grasslands, things like that. And there's not much that goes on. And yet, despite that, you have recurring characters who are on their own journeys, and you get to, if you want to, you get to figure out where they, what they're doing, where they go. They're there along beside you just to help you out. There are things that, I guess, even the thoughts is something I want to talk about as well. There's an aspect that helps you gain more insight into more people. You want to gain more story or opinions. Even some good puzzle hints there, just by doing that. I remember trying to get the 3 sword techniques and figuring out, oh, that's what they want to do. And so that was a fun aspect of almost world building and hinting together. It was a very, very nice thing. And just creating that together is an ideal way of creating a story without having extra unnecessary text, and I do love that. And I guess talking about not adding extra unnecessary text, I guess a lot of the world building is relatively silent, if that makes sense. There are things that happen where, all you need to do is observe and learn. and you see how things behave. Perhaps you see some enemy patterns that attack recklessly. Or perhaps you see well, changes in the world itself and the people within it, and see what that's like. A very good way to show that the world is changing. And that time passes, and at points where, well, and you see where actions matter. And I do love that about the game. Talking about actions, moving on from the world, I wanted to talk a bit about kind of, I guess, the action system? Yeah. Or general movement, things like that. And from here, I guess my big one is the notion of upgrades. Kind of tying to the fact that the world is open to you, you could get some of the upgrades whenever you want. And with it, they provide a means of doing things differently, depending on when you have access to things. And I like that. And the thing about the upgrades themselves is they feel generally minimal. It's not really... When you think of an upgrade, usually it's big or it helps you in a big way, but for me, well, yeah, the upgrades they don't do much, but I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Because well, despite the fact that they feel minimal, they have such a big contribution to what they do in, well, the knight's repertoire. For instance, I guess you get a wall jump. It's a simple upgrade. All it allows you to do is jump on walls constantly and grab onto walls. And yet, because of that, just because of that small upgrade, now you could do some very nice, well, what would you call them, jump platforming segments. Or you could enhance your combat technique to apply the use of walls. And then you get something like double jump. Once again, not much. You just jump twice. But then, once again, it's a big contribution to, well, how you move and how you platform, but also a great way to enhance your combat methods. And that's all just from figuring things out yourself. There's no need for some skill tree or whatnot. And so that's kind of what makes combat so, well, yeah, it makes combat platforming so fun and satisfying. Movement in of itself feels so smooth and easy to do. Once you get it, you just get it. Based on my research, their movement was kind of based on the Mega Man X series. I'm barely familiar with it, but honestly, just based on wall jumping itself, I do feel that change, especially with dashes as well. And just to have movement to be so satisfying, it's an important part to nail in the game because, well, that's what you're doing for pretty much the entire game is movement. So you better like the way you move, otherwise it's not. Otherwise, there's not a lot of game to be satisfied with. I guess going off of that as well, charm system. Charm system was quite interesting. Minor issues, just about, some of the charms. Maybe some of them didn't necessarily need to be added on, but I do like its diversity and how you can mix up how you deal with things. Perhaps you want something that doesn't provide knockback, or perhaps you don't care about knockback, and it allows room for other things. As I said before, there might be things that might not necessarily There are some charms that maybe I had issues with. For instance, map navigation was a very interesting aspect to set as a pin. A charm, sorry. Despite it feeling like it was kind of necessary to see where you are in the map. So adding that as a hindrance is interesting. Or maybe having, well, 4 separate charms that provide extra health. A bit of an odd choice. But, well, it makes sense, but I don't know if all of them were necessary. But all in all, the mix and match system was I I did enjoy that, and I mean to have it so limiting was interesting for you to kind of play around with and experiment. There are a lot of unique charms that are fun. So those are fun in of itself, especially when, well, when dealing with bigger enemies and bosses, trying to figure out a system that works and whatnot. I feel like a lot of what I'm talking about is praises. And honestly, yeah, I feel maybe it's just because I'm not used to talking about downsides of things, but we'll give it a shot here, or a little bit here. And, well, I guess this is a bit of a weird one. An unfortunate one at that, but I want to talk about the music of the game. Now, let's get all of the. Well, I really like the music of the game. I'll say that now. People have praised the soundtracks from Mountains High, and there's an extent to which I agree with it. I did enjoy the music that people love, especially when it comes to, well, boss fights. The soundtracks there were amazing. I enjoyed things like well, the fight in the village and the Great Prince fight. Honestly, the Great Prince fight might be my favorite. Yeah, my favorite of Hollow Knight. Although that might just be because I'm so used to hearing it many, many, many times. So they were very hard-hitting pieces, and they definitely feel like they were engaging, they were active. It definitely felt challenging. So I guess the question is, what's the problem that I find with the music? And generally, while the boss music, and fights were really good, well, first off, I think there were about 2 boss fights where music felt missing. I think there was a boss in the Crystal Mines where there wasn't anything, yeah, where the music wasn't, there wasn't a boss fight. Well, there wasn't boss fight music there, despite being, well, fairly difficult or challenging. All you got was the dynamic version of the ambient themes in the back. Which I should mention, I also appreciate the dynamic music. Whenever you're fighting an enemy and the music builds up, yeah, it's not something that's needed, but it's very, very appreciated. But I guess talking about ambient music, I feel like that's kind of one of the downfalls of Hollow Knight, where I didn't feel like the ambient music did enough. Well, some of them anyways. There's some great ones, I should mention. So things like Green Path and City of Tears were solid. I remember those tunes, I remember how they went. But because the theme of Hollow Knight is being kind of empty and alone, and they tried to match that style, it kind of made the ambient music a bit empty and alone as well. And I feel like they could have done a bit more, and just things were generally lacking. there are times where I just don't recall the songs or sounds of other places. For instance, I have here Kingdom's Edge and Abyss, where that I don't even recognize them when I'm playing through them. I don't. Well, I'm not even sure if I hear them. Sometimes it might just be volume, where I don't know. They just, for me, I feel like they need a little bit more. And the game shows that it could do it. For instance, something like, I'm forgetting the place, the cemetery. Wonderful piece. Or, well, an empty place. And I feel like, I don't know, I feel like they could have done a bit more. But, yeah, that's, yeah, that's it. Man, it's weird for me talking about negatives, especially for one that people really love. I should mention, yeah, I like the music a lot, but it's just kind of weighed down a bit by not having good enough, well, I don't know, not having, how do I do this to phrase this to the degree I want it? Not to the caliber in which I would enjoy uh some background music to to areas, I guess would be the way I'd put it. Yeah. Anyways, moving on. Speaking of music and art, guess the art style is the second to last thing I have right here. What is my time at? 26 minutes. Okay. Art, once again, I like it. It makes its own unique style, and it shows. If someone were to, yeah, depict something, you'd be able to tell that's Hollow Knight right away. And so having that unique art style, having that signature is, well, very nice to have, and great way of distinguishing, well, Hollow Knight from any other game, which is a big plus. And to that extent, Silksong as well. I love the background environments, and it's amazing what they did, despite it being a game that is just consistently underground. It's a bug game where all you are is in a hole, and yet it's amazing, well, of the choice of things that they chose to do with said hole in the ground. You know, right? It feels like every place is associated with its own color. Every world, well, feels like every area is its own unique world, and everything feels like it fits in. It makes sense within that world, which definitely helps towards kind of that world building and world creation. And so seeing all the distinct colors, or lack thereof even just the lack of colors in some areas, is phenomenal. I really enjoyed it, and I'm amazed how much creativity there was in, well, creating those environments. I have written here that there was kind of a bit of a minor issue I've had when playing the game, where sometimes, just based on how they did the art, it could be hard to distinguish background and foreground, where there might be something that looks like a platform or a wall, for instance, and you try to jump towards it, but it turns out it's just something in the background and you fall off. There's a few times it did that, but it's a minor complaint from me. Okay, we're almost done. And so the last thing I really wanted to talk about is the second to last, and then we'll have a bit of a review. Kind of the replayability of the game. And, well, yeah, I finished and talk about my experiences with it. I finished the game, and I mean, even in the middle of playing the game, I wanted to play the game again, just to explore what I missed, just to see ways I could have gone but didn't. There's always, well, yeah, there's always, you know, hidden treasures that you never got to, or NPCs you didn't get to meet. even when I thought I did a lot of the game and finished it, just reading up on it and trying and checking back on things I didn't get to see is quite amazing. And of course, not only that, but well, there's a hard mode, and well, yeah, there's a hard mode. Simple as that. And that's always fun and challenging to go through. Hollow Knight itself, felt it was actually had a nice difficulty level for me. It might be harder for some, but for me it was okay. It was moderately challenging, and so hard mode was a very fun way to actually amp up the difficulty. Although it only did one thing, but I guess the stakes made it scarier. There were also other fun extra bosses and events to find, which I missed one extra boss fight entirely, and there are other events that, I've yet to see, alternate endings as well. And so there's that. Yeah, pretty much mentioned everything on replayability. It's fun to go back through, even though you know the world. I mean, even while trying to speedrun it, getting a lot of the speedrun achievements in the game. That that was also an interesting challenge as well. And so it feels like there's always something to come back to when you open Hollow Knight again. And well, I'm still opening up Hollow Knight again, just to just to try to actually complete the game. Ah, so all in all, I guess I said a lot about the game, of how I enjoyed it a fair bit, and honestly, I completely understand why it could be so loved 5 years later. It's insane to say 5 years later, but yeah, I know that people love this game. I wouldn't, well, call it my favorite, or even put it within my tops. Well, I don't know, top five. But generally, it's because it's not my genre style or whatnot, but doesn't mean I didn't enjoy the game. And well, I still like the game a lot. And is one that I still will come back to. Because it's just that kind of game. Surprisingly, a Metroidvania that could call you back. It's amazing considering, well, it being a Metroidvania. And so I'm glad that this game kind of sticks out from that genre. I'm glad it's able to have unique art style, unique music, or solid music, solid movement. Everything seems good. Well, great. And so I'm glad I finally caught up on what people think and what they know. I'm glad that I get to, well, be a part of that now. Because, well, Hollow Knight's been really fun. And, well, I guess like a whole lot of people, I'm looking forward to Silksong. Which I'll very likely do. Because I enjoyed the first. Well, yeah, enjoyed the first. Ah, okay, I think that's everything. That was a lot that I wanted to talk about, but it's a lot of me, well, freestyling and rambling in the form of a review. But yeah, first time I wanted to try out a review, see what that's like. I know I said a lot of positives, just because I don't like to dabble on the negatives too much. I gave it a shot as well. So, I don't know. That's been my stream. Those have been my thoughts. And I guess if you haven't played Hollow Knight, I'd I'd recommend it. It's always fun and well, it's timeless as well. Definitely want a game that I don't see well kind of lose its luster over the course of time. Yeah, that's it. I really don't know how to end these, do I?